Okay, to pick up where we left off, what we had was basically a form that will submit something, and, well, we had to actually call a refetch to get this data to actually refetch. And now part of the benefit of Apollo is that we shouldn't have to do that, because if Apollo is aware of when you are mutating the data, shouldn't it be aware of if that data is changed and if you want it to, well, re-grab that data? So let's take a look at some of what we can do to actually make that process a little bit easier. And I'm also going to simplify the query just a little bit too. We can talk about some of the things that you can do within your queries. So what we actually want to do here is first head to the area of our code, which was in our resolution form, where we said, hey, refetch. And I'm going to comment this out. Simply just so we know that the refetch isn't happening. We can actually even come to our app after it refreshes and try to add a new one. New one, submit, nothing happened until a refresh. And then you can see new one shows up after a refresh. So obviously this refetch isn't happening. So let's go ahead and get this refetch happening simply within our mutation itself by, well, we have to specify the query that we want to be refetched within our mutation. So we have our constant mutation right here. We defined it as create resolution. But when we actually use it, which is down here, and we use this GraphQL tag, we pass in and we give it a name, create resolution, we can actually pass in some options as well. So these options, let's do actually a comma here, comma options, and options is going to be an object. Now inside of this object are all sorts of things such as update queries, refetch queries, optimistic response variables, all this sort of stuff, right? But the one we're most interested in is in refetch queries. And here we actually need to pass in an array of strings of the query name. Now let's actually head back to our, let's see, I believe it was our app.js where we used our hi query here. Even though we defined this constant variable, a hi query, as GraphQL, this didn't actually assign this query itself a name. This hi query variable was simply just the variable or the constant variable that this GraphQL tag was stored in. The query itself starts with this bracket here. And we saw an example of this in our resolution form during our mutation, which was right here. And here we said, hey, we have a mutation and here's what it's called. And then here is the bracket starting that mutation. So just like that, we could give this a query and then a name. And so this is where you actually define your name, and this can simply just be, well, we can just say resolutions, okay? It's a basic name and it's super easy. So just query named resolutions. And I'm going to go ahead and now come down in here into our mutation under refetch queries and give this the name of the query that we want to refetch, which is resolutions. Okay, so just like this. So what we're basically saying here is, hey, on our mutation, whenever this is actually mutated, go ahead and refetch this query name resolutions. The query named resolutions is defined right here, and we just passed it in to our GraphQL on the app file. So if we head in here to our application now, we'll be able to see that this query definitively has a name. If you come into your network tab and click on the GraphQL that's right here, and then select headers, you can see that we have, well, an operation name. So the request payload has an operation name of resolutions. It's a query named resolutions, and here's all this sort of stuff. So now let's actually see this in action here. If I have a new one, which is get mutation auto updating submit, you can see now we are now getting this to refetch the data automatically without having to manually run some sort of refetch command that was passed in via a prop into our resolution form. So let's go ahead and we can now delete this data.refetch. boom, it's gone from resolution form, and resolution form right here, we can go ahead and, we can even remove this entire then and just have a catch here. And this should work entirely just fine now that we don't have to specify, hey, go get that data again. But the cool thing is that GraphQL, or Apollo specifically, gives you the ability to refetch if you want to refetch here. Or you can have it, well, hey, do it automatically when you refetch this query. And we can always just verify this is working. Okay, so obviously there are some things like the text not removing itself, but these are all little React things and not necessarily GraphQL specific, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. One other thing I wanted to cover in this video is how to simplify our query. In our app.js, we simply said, hey, here's the query, and we passed it in via GraphQL on this hi query right here. For one, let's go ahead and just change the name of hi query. I'm going to remove hi from the query entirely, and we can just change this to resolutions query itself, just so it's a little bit more obvious. And what we're going to be doing is dealing with this data, because in the past couple of videos, what we saw was when we returned data from GraphQL, we had data with a whole bunch of stuff in it, right? It had the loading state, it had our actual data. Sorry, I got to delete this data.hi as well. It had our resolutions, but it all lived within data. This.props.data. Whatever. I mean, that's a lot of, depth, I think, for an object. So what happens if you don't want to have to deal with data here, and you maybe want your data prop to be passed in as a prop? So just the loading prop or the resolutions prop rather than the data.resolutions. Well, we can actually have access to the data that comes into our query via some options here, again, within this GraphQL. So you saw this a moment ago with our mutation where we got to pass in some options, and you even saw it before briefly with the name, but we could even do very similar things with our queries themselves. So let's go ahead and add a comma here after the resolutions query, and I'm simply going to have an object. Now inside of this object, one of the things we have access to is a property called props, which is where we're going to be able to assign our props that come into our component. Now you could do a few things here, but the main way of doing it here is to simply have a arrow function that accepts an object. We can do some destructuring here to access the data, and I'm simply going to return an object. Now the object that we're returning here is now going to be what your props are. For instance, if we wanted our resolutions to come in as resolutions rather than data.resolutions, we could say resolutions is now equal to data.resolutions. Now, this is tedious, and this is a lot of extra code just to get, the removal of this data property coming in here. Is there a faster way to do this? And absolutely, if you don't need this kind of control, the fastest and best way, is basically through plain JavaScript. If we were to say object ... data, what this is now saying is, hey, give me all of the things that are coming in data and assign them each as a prop, because we're using this spread on the object to assign all of our props. Now our whole app is going to break right now because obviously data no longer exists, but what we should be able to see is we should have access to, instead of data.loading, we should be able to remove data from here and now have access to loading and resolutions themselves as props rather than having to deal with this data stuff. So let's remove data.loading and data.resolutions. So this is a little cleaner. What this does is it's going to make your React components a little less reliant on the GraphQL stuff, because now we don't have to deal with data, right? And I just realized, I'm sorry, these file names are getting cut off. This is app.js. I'm so sorry. What we're dealing with here is now a React component that's simply looking for a loading state and resolutions. And this component is much less aware of GraphQL because, your data isn't stuck inside of a data dot, right? And so again, here's our app code. It's much cleaner. And down here is our query, which obviously we had to add a line of code here, but this beats having data.everything in my opinion. So, two things. Again, refetch your queries by being able to pass in a refetch queries into your mutations. Two, in your queries, we can actually give our query the access to reassign the data coming in as props via this little slick line of code right here. Okay, so I hope this simplifies some things for you. In the next video, we are going to talk about getting this connected to Meteor's account system, which I know is something that everyone wants to see because it's going to be easier than you're expecting too. And we're going to do it kind of quick and dirty with the form to sign up. I hope that is okay. I have a longer term solution for that as well. So in the next video, we're going to be getting account set up, and then we're going to start having your resolutions being attached to the current user. So as always, this is Scott with Level Up Tutorials. If you have any questions or comments, leave a comment in the video or hit me up at Twitter or Facebook at Level Up Tutorials. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.